Hello and welcome to the Mumbai Film Festival panel discussion on the portrayal of the portrayal of women in Indian cinema. I'm supposed to be the moderator. I'm not too sure exactly what I'm going to be moderating here because it seems like the panel today is roughly on the same side of the divide. We don't have, as you put it, Times Now kind of news hour kind of debate on exactly how women have been portrayed in films over the years and how that's changed. The premise here is obviously how much movies influence people in the first place. To what extent does what happens in a cinema either reflects the society we live in, or actually reinforces all the stereotypes of the society itself? I'll start with you, Sudhir. To what extent do you think films influence us in terms of how we think, in terms of how we behave, or are we making too much of it in the first place?
For instance, Indian cinema and women, it's been much maligned, but they have always existed in Indian cinema, two strands, and the more progressive strand has always been a little ahead of the value system society. Now, let me suggest to you the films of, let's say, not take the typical our cinema kind of examples, but if you take the example of something like, say, someone like Nasir Hussain, Now, there is a very interesting way of looking at it, which somebody once said, I forget who, but, for instance, in Nasir Hussain's cinema, the hill station was a place where you escaped tradition and you could go and fall in love. Right? And beyond that, popular cinema has always, fortunately or unfortunately, unfortunately, always maintain the status quo in terms of women. And I think the obscenity in popular cinema is not so much the obscenity of how you say the sexy so-and-so and some sleazy lyrics, but how women are portrayed in regressive ways and how they are supposed to exist within this with this patriarch, and the idea of respect and the idea of what in the so-called good woman in Indian cinema, a woman who does not express her desires or can't sort of take and move out of the system of the family to be something on her own, and if she's a slut. That is more obscene, and that has been the negative influence, let's say, right, on society rather than a positive.
To take you up on the fact of what is a good woman and what is a bad woman, and the way popular cinema has influenced our belief on that. Shobha, to come to you on this, there was a time back in the 50s and the 60s where there would be two kinds of women in our films. One would be the tantalizing, the smoking vamp, as it were. The other would be the heroine, who would be more on the side of being conservative, slightly quiet, almost divine in her characterization. Now, when you look at 2000 onwards, or perhaps late 90s onwards, and especially with actors who are so there would be the Helens, and the Nadiras of the world, and there would be the Madhubalas and the Meena Kumaris of the world. The two never really met in terms of them being perhaps being the same woman, perhaps because the audience saw them as two separate things. But now the audience would see, say, a Kareena Kapoor or a Katrina Kaif. She could be the item girl, but she could also be a hardcore conservative heroine. Do you think the two are perhaps merging at this point?
Well, the reasons that they're merging are essentially commercial. Instead of hiring someone to do the job that Helen did so wonderfully well, it's just easier for today's girls to perform both the roles themselves. But the two things that have not changed, and I don't see them changing at all, is the virtuous Indian woman. The virtuous Indian woman and the two predominant emotions that have to be projected, whether it's a Kareena playing a tramp as well as the girl she's playing, the character she's playing, is the two emotions are sacrifice and obedience. So that has not changed. The traditional Indian woman continues to live within those parameters. Essentially, at the end of the day, she has to she has to learn from her mistakes. she has to be taught a lesson one way or the other by society at large, and quite often by her family or even her friends. So there are two or three films which have broken through this in recent times, and I find that very fascinating. And I would say the strongest comment about a woman who's pretty much in charge of her own life, ready to take her own decisions, good, bad, ugly, whatever they may be, and assume responsibility for those decisions, was with the Pariniti character in Shuddh Desi Romance. I thought she spoke a very contemporary, very new language. She broke through the mold fabulously well. It ended on a note that was ambiguous. It ended on a note which says, well, look here, I mean, it's all very well. I don't want marriage. I definitely don't want to conform. I'm willing to take my chances in a small town and live by my own rules. I thought that was a very significant film, and so was, in its own way, Dirty Picture. And there was another one which also broke rules quite wonderfully, was Vidya Balan in
Ishqiya.
Ishqiya.
Right. But when you talk about desires and the boundaries, especially inside the house, Nanda, you did Fire. I think Deepa is right here, and you did Fire in 1996, and there was this whole moral brigade, and there was consensus on how this was very un-Indian in terms of its cultural context. If that same film was to be made today in India and to be released in theaters, do you think the reaction would be the same? Or how far have we gone since 96?
This is also to answer your first question that you in fact asked, Sudhir, and if I can just start with that. You said, do films really have an impact, or do we just sort of imagine that impact? Or does it go beyond hairstyles and clothes and all that? I think in the question there is a bit of an assumption of the mainstream cinema, and we're calling Indian cinema as the Hindi mainstream. And because I've done a lot more sort of regional work as well, so I just want to broaden that definition. That probably the mainstream, maybe that is a greater influence, but there are also these other films that are being made that do portray not just women but situations, life, different predicaments in a different way. And because the arts, it's very difficult to gauge the tangible impact of the arts. But I think all of us that we are here, I mean, we are influenced by films, books, people, things that we have read and seen, and in such intangible ways that we ourselves don't know till we have to respond to a situation and we feel that, oh, that must have impacted me. Fire is definitely one of those films that, and not because I've acted and not because Deepa is here, but it's truly one of those films that have actually tangibly impacted a society. And I can say that because in 96 I know even English speaking daily journalists wouldn't have the vocabulary to even ask the questions. I remember the first screening we had, it was in Kerala, and they would say, so how does it feel to do that kind of a film or that kind of a relationship? They were hesitant to even utter the word lesbian or gay or homosexual. And so I think the fact we have come here today, where there's a lot more discourse, there's a lot more public debate about the issue. The fact that Article 377, which criminalizes homosexuality, the fact that Delhi High Court actually took it up.
So, I mean, it's been pushed so much under carpet over the years, Sriram. Do you think, in that sense, films have played possibly a positive role in the past few years and actually bring it out in terms of discussion? When Shobha mentioned a movie like Shuddh Desi Romance. It is about two people who could be in love outside the boundaries of marriage, and it's seen to be okay by the audiences, rather, while it would not even be discussed in regular homes before. Do you think at some level popular culture takes a lead in this and is perhaps even better than the society we live in?
No, but I somehow don't feel that there were not no such films earlier. I mean, take movies like Guide or
Right.
I mean, Guide, Bandhani, all these movies came at the same time, and they were strong women, and they were terrific
There were always
characters.
these two streams, always.
Right.
Yeah,
They
and
broke the-
on the way here, I was just talking to a colleague of mine, Pooja, who wrote my first film, which had a kind of Urmila was the main protagonist.
Right.
So I was telling her, oh my God, I'm going for this thing, and I can't talk academic, So she told me about something called the Bechdel test, which I didn't know about, and I was on the way just thinking of movies, which is an American kind of some journalist or somebody had made that test about films, where the questions asked is 3 questions, whether the film passes that test. First is, does it have 2 women characters in it
I've heard
with
of
names?
this. Right.
Second, do they talk to each other?
Yeah.
And third is, do they talk to each other about something other than a man? Now, 80% of movies fall. I mean,
95
and it's not about the movie is good because of that or
Right.
wrong because of that, but it just shows how little we really have interesting roles for women in our movies. We have 10%, 20% maybe. I mean, like if I'm talking about last year, I'll talk about Kahani and English to English and couple more movies.
Right.
That's it. Otherwise, like, the other 80% is, I mean, either they're playing sometimes good characters, sometimes silly characters, and like.
Or in the name of sort of women-centric.
Yeah, yeah.